Hi, everyone. My name is Mel Ziegler. I'm chair of the Visiting Artists Committee at the Department of Art at Vanderbilt here. And I would like to welcome you all to the department's 15th year of the Studio VU Artist Lecture Series. And we're very excited about today's lecture, Marie Watt. But before I turn it over to Jana Harper to introduce her, I just want to kind of introduce the program a little bit. First of all, I want to let you know that we have Stephanie Saijuko coming in February, on February 9th, and I hope you'll join us then. And I'd like to express my thanks to the other Visiting Artists Committee members, Professor Magdalena Campos-Pons and Patrick DeGuerra. And then I would also like to say our thanks to our department chair, Mark Hosford, who was very supportive of our program and continues supporting it financially, as well as the Dean of Arts and Science. And without them, we wouldn't be able to continue this lecture series. And it's very exciting to have this going on for 15 years. But most importantly, I'd also like to thank the Margaret Stonewall Wooldridge Hamlet Endowment, which helps us fund the visiting artists to spend extra time and meet with the seniors on a one-on-one or through a seminar. And that's a kind of important part of the program as well. And that comes from that fund. And I want to actually thank our staff, which we often don't thank enough. Particularly Jerry Phillips, who's been very good at organizing all of this and doing the posters and announcing everything, and I really appreciate it. But I also want to thank Emily too, Emily Stewart, who's our admin specialist, who also does a lot for making sure that our artists get paid. And it used to be making arrangements for flights, but since we're doing Zoom, we're not doing that. But anyway, hopefully again, maybe next year we'll be able to do that. So I want to thank you all, and I'm very excited to turn it over to my colleague Jana Harper to introduce Marie Watt. Jana.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm really honored to introduce Marie Watt today. Her accolades are as wide as they are deep, with 4 degrees and many, oh, sorry, I was just getting something on the screen. Can you hear me? Can I just have a?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Marie has received many honors from a wide range of institutions, the Harpo Foundation, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Edeljorg Fellowship, which is a big one. And her work is in many major collections, the Whitney, the Museum of Modern Art, the Smithsonian, the Denver Art Museum, the Portland Art Museum. But I think that I really want to speak more about what moves me about Marie's work and why I feel like, excuse me, we're so fortunate to have her with us in our community, is that the way that Marie navigates Indigenous knowledge systems in Western protocols is really astounding to me. And her work is incredibly generous. It has a kind of a humility in it that I think many of us reach towards. And excuse me, because I've been sick, so I'm also a little choked up because I just think she's amazing and I'm a little bit of a fangirl. But in a kind of Western art system that really celebrates and glorifies the individual, Marie has this incredible way of decentering. And I find that the work is decentering in a good way. She takes the kind of light and shines it back on the community, and she shines it back on the non-human. I'm sure we'll hear about her work, Companion Species, but one of my absolute favorite things was an interview that she gave to Joseph Beuys's Coyote, and they had a conversation. And so I just feel like we're really fortunate to have Marie here in our Vanderbilt community and working with our students. And please join me in welcoming Marie Watt. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jana, and thank you, Mel and Jerry and Magna. Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, it's a real honor to be here. And I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the territory where the Chinook, Clackamas, and Multnomah Indigenous people historically stewarded the land. I always like to start by sharing a little bit about myself. And these are my parents, Dave and Romaine Watt. And I affectionately refer to them as my roadies. Here they are helping me with an installation at the Aldrich Museum of Art, probably around, wow, 2006 or so. But my mom is a citizen of the Seneca Nation of Indians, as am I, actually. This is a picture that my husband, Adam, loves to refer to as 3 generations of Seneca teeth. And my mom grew up on the Cattaraugus Reservation with 6 siblings, and my grandparents' first language was Seneca. She grew up at a time where it was, I think, as a survival skill, kids were oftentimes not taught the language. And so she grew up listening to adults speaking it, but not learning it herself. And the Seneca language was not allowed in the Thomas Indian School where that she attended. So one thing I'd like to share with you about our community is that we're a matrilineal society, and in our community, women have historically had the responsibility of owning and stewarding the land. And in fact, I think owning is probably even an inappropriate term, or it's something that is more of a Western idea, because land, of course, is something that we belong to the land, and we have this kind of reciprocal relationship with it. But land ownership has historically been the domain of women. Our clan is passed on through our mothers. I'm from the Turtle Clan. And also voting has traditionally been done by women to nominate a tribal chairperson or leader. Although now in our community, we have more of a Western ballot style of voting. And last but not least, our enrollment also comes through our mothers. And one of the things, the reasons why I'm sharing this particular image with you, Susan B. Anthony with Woodland's influence. I know she looks a little bit like George Washington here, but the Iroquois lived in proximity to the suffragists in Seneca Falls, New York. And so specifically Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. And these suffragists were very interested in the rights and responsibilities that Iroquois, or we call ourselves the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse, and they drew from this knowledge to create the suffragist, what they referred to as the Suffragist Bible. So another thing I wanted to share about our clan system is that we have 8 clans, and 4 are birds or bird-like, and 4 tend to walk the earth, or they're 4-legged animals. And so I'm from the Turtle Clan, and traditionally you would marry the opposite in order to kind of create balance. And so my husband, he is non-native, but he is a graphic designer, and his moniker is the humble crow. And so I feel like there's a little bit of balance in our relationship there. So I want to share with you all that I started, actually, when I started going to school at Willamette University, I was not an art major, but I was at a liberal arts college where I was able to take classes in different disciplines. And I was really excited to be able to take an art class. And I eventually added that as an art and art history major as a double major. And so it wasn't something that I knew I wanted to do. And it's something that, like, as time continued, I just kind of kept moving in this direction of making work and learning more about my relationship with different materials. And so I started as a painter and a printmaker, and then maybe after graduating from my MFA program, I started to realize that I really enjoyed working with objects and materials. And so in 2003, I had been teaching at Portland Community College and was on sabbatical to prepare for a show at the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian's Gustav High location. And I was collecting blankets from thrift stores. I would collect anything $5 and under. I was really interested in how blankets were these objects that in my family, we would give away to acknowledge a person for being witness to another important life event. And in the process of doing that, I really realized that blankets are these objects that receive us. They accompany our departure from this life, but we're constantly imprinting on them. And so this was the very first installation that I did with blankets. And originally I thought this would be this kind of columnar form. And very quickly when I took it, these kind of molds away, box kind of like molds away from the sides, there was this curve linear motion came into place. And one of the things that it made me think about is that blankets, even though we tend to think of them as square objects, they really take on the shape of the bodies that inhabit them. They're very much kind of pelt-like objects. So this is an installation at the Institute of American Indian Arts called Blanket Stories Ladder. And it also starts to explore the use of different materials, including bronze, and in the foreground using reclaimed wood. That I tend to think of wood as being very blanket-like in the ways we apply it, right? So wood to construct houses, or wood to create kind of a shed or an arbor. But also one of the things that I love when you carve wood and using reclaimed wood, I found that even using a beam where it hasn't been, I don't know, connected to the forest, say in 50 to 100 years, when you go back and carve it, it actually still yields sap. And then the other thing that for me is a signifier of its relationship as like this living material is just that the wood checks, and it's a sign that it's breathing. And so that's kind of what that cracking is. And then I also am really just drawn to the grain and how blanket like that grain pattern feels. So in about 2012, or really after I did the kind of earliest blanket column, I started to realize that when people came up to these objects, that they responded to how they would respond to particular blankets, and they would kind of launch into story. And so in the very first installation, I included a book, blank book made by an artist, and invited people to share their blanket stories. And I was moved by how intimate and detailed these stories were. And so over time, the practice evolved to invite people to share a blanket and a blanket story. In exchange for that, I would trade a print. And one of the things that was so interesting to me about this project, and this is actually the very first blanket story column in which every single blanket was donated by a member from the community. And this installation is at the National Gallery of Canada, and it's also where the object now resides. So one of the things that I think is interesting about this exchange in which people contribute blankets is that there's an option for people to give a blanket that's a placeholder or not the real blanket that is storied, but oftentimes people really do share that story. And so I love this particular one as it's such a great example. I remember the first time my grandfather told me that the blankets come from sheep. And every time we went for a drive into the country, I would look for white and green striped sheep. This is a more recent project and kind of an example of how I have pivoted my practice during this moment of the pandemic. I am part of an exhibition in collaboration with the artist Chanupa Hanska Luger. The show is called Each Other, and it originated at the Denver Art Museum. And for that show, I invited people from collaborating institutions. So from Denver, from the Carlos Museum, and Emory University in Atlanta, and then from the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. We did like a large call for blankets, and people sent them in over the course of 4 weeks. And so again, people were given a print in exchange for their contribution. But one of the things that's interesting about this project is that because of the catalog deadline, I was asked if I could give the sculpture a title before it had actually been completed. And so the very first blanket that came in was from a man in Provincetown, and he talked about how his great-grandmother was a Polish immigrant, and she made these blankets. She worked in textile mills, and she made these blankets. And so the first word in this title really acknowledges our, these kind of great-grandmother blanket stories. The pandemic, of course, this piece was made during the pandemic, but there were 3 different blankets that came in that really responded to the pandemic in particular. And one woman made a blanket out of leftover scraps from making PPP or masks. And so there was that blanket, and there was another woman who knitted herself, or actually she really knitted a baby blanket for an anticipated niece or nephew in her family. And in the process of teaching herself how to knit, she made 3 or 4 of these blankets, but she talked about how the comfort of the she talked about how she became comforted by being in this kind of cocoon of yarn and being kind of surrounded by this blanket. And then last but not least, one of the pandemic blankets was from a woman who really wanted to respond to the houselessness that was also occurring and is still a significant issue in this moment. And so she was making these fleece tied blankets, and has made over 150 and sent one of those blankets to be part of this project as a way of acknowledging this story that's impacting our communities right now. And then last but not least, in the title, I wanted to reference that Joy Harjo, the first Native and Indigenous poet laureate, who wrote this wonderful book, many books of poetry, but most recently American Sunrise. And so Daybreak really is a way of acknowledging Muskogee Creek poet Joy Harjo. So this is sort of an example of what that looks like. The prints that were shared for this collaboration are pressure prints. So simultaneous to this practice of making these blanket columns that sort of link sky and ground, and they actually really make me think of our creation story, the Seneca and Haudenosaunee creation story, in which Sky Woman falls from a hole in the sky and is first helped by birds, and then animals settle on what we now refer to as Turtle Island. I also really liked this notion of these blanket story columns sort of relating to linen closets and having connections to Brancusi's endless columns, not to mention having been born and raised in the Pacific Northwest, just thinking about totem poles and the conifers that are so abundant here. So in preparation for this exhibition in 2004, I invited people to come and participate in these sewing circles. And the sewing circles started thinking that it would just be sort of this one-time thing that might happen. And I think very quickly I realized that sewing circles were more than a barn raising. So they weren't just many hands making light work and this part of this neighborly exchange, but the sewing circles were a way of getting to know your neighbor and really connecting with people. And so creating something that was like different than like making what was on the table. And I would say that the thing that is stitched is imprinted with the stories and the exchange that happens around it. And so when I started the sewing circles, there was no social media as we know it today, but I did start using email, which was really new at the moment, to reach out to friends and invite people to stitch. And what I normally would say is, please come and stitch, no sewing experience necessary. I'll feed you. You can come and go as you wish, and you can bring a friend. And people would show up. And I think that I learned more about people I did know, as well as I made a lot of new friends in the process. And I think that that happened with other people who participated as well. So one of the things that happened as I continued to host sewing circles is at some point I was invited to participate in a sewing circle, I think at the University of Washington, or participate and be a visiting artist and host a sewing circle with students, but the class was going to be about 60 people. And I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to have a bunch of people stitch all around one piece. And so in that particular case, I started to think differently about how I might host the sewing circles. And I ended up creating a large kind of canvas of blankets and projecting a drawing that I had done on it, and used tape to pattern the drawing, and then cut everything up into these blocks. And then the blocks were what people received and stitched. And they were invited to stitch on the left side of the tape or the right side of the tape, and over the tape, but not through the tape. And luckily, I see Jerry over there. I think he might have held up his piece, but some of you have actually participated in the sewing circles, and I'm really interested in hearing feedback and hearing more about your experience at the sewing circles that happened at Vanderbilt through Magna and maybe Jana's class. So one of the things that I really love about this image, this sewing circle happened at the National Gallery of Canada. There were over 230 people in the course of 3 hours. And I love how it's just almost one continuous table. And it makes me think of like what could have happened in a really long house, right? Or large long house. And I think one of the things that I really have gratitude for in this practice is this kind of return to communities. And so this sewing circle happened sometime after that blanket story column had happened at the National Gallery of Canada. And so it was lovely to return and reconnect with people, as well as make new friends and connections. So at the sewing circles, our youngest participants have been 2 to 3 to 93 years old. So they're all ages events. And one of the things I'm really drawn to is these conversations that in many ways for me model an Indigenous teaching and learning style. But I think if we look back at any of our communities and traditions, if we look back far enough, this is the way we gathered and learned. So it's multi-generational, and it's cross-disciplinary and even cross-cultural. And I think that it's a place that I like to think of this place that I set the table to bring all of these people together. So in 2014, I was invited to be a resident artist at the Denver Art Museum. And while I was there, I had sewing circles, and people would just kind of drop into this artist in residency space. And there were a couple of young women who were part of a summer camp, and they dropped in, and we were stitching, and I learned that they were both powwow dancers, and one dressed the jingle dress dance, which is a healing dance, and the other dressed the fancy shawl dance, which is a dance in which one dances in a way that might mimic the movement or agility of a butterfly or even a deer. And so I knew I was going to be coming back to Denver, and I specifically made a piece in response to their stories. And so that piece is Butterfly that you saw on the last screen. But what was really lovely is that simultaneous to the Denver Art Museum's annual powwow, we held this sewing circle. And I think the thing that I'm really drawn, this piece for me is marks a very specific moment in my practice when I decided to take the work away from the wall. And part of that rationale was I was never satisfied with the way blankets acted on the wall, because they suddenly became still and inactive, and it just wasn't true to its nature. And so by moving things away from the wall, it allowed the work to respond to elements like the air. So the blankets sometimes move when you walk past them or when you're looking at them. I liked the idea that in the case of Butterfly, it could look like the jingles might make a sound, or could more easily make a sound and have this kind of music. I liked that it was just in general truer to the way we experience blankets as covers and sheets and tents and forts, and all a multitude of associations. So within the last couple of years, I've really been asking this question: what would the world be like if we considered ourselves companion species? And part of that question for me came from this understanding from being Seneca that we are related to animals. And in our creation story, in which Sky Woman falls from the sky and animals help her, we consider our animals to be first teachers. And our clan relationships is a way of acknowledging this historic relationship with animals. And so I started thinking about what would the entry point be if you didn't think of yourself as related to animals. Where would the starting point be? And in Western culture, for me, that is really in our pets. And while I like to say I'm a little bit of a cat person, I also, this last year and a half, we have a dog now. And I really decided to focus on dogs. And so one of the things I often do is research in relationship to my interests and the ideas I'm exploring. And so I came upon this image of the Capeltine wolf. And there's so many things that drew me to this image. But one of the things that I guess I'll just go ahead and tell you some of those things. So one of the things that I am drawn to is that this wolf is mothering, but it's not a biological mother. She looks emaciated. You can see her ribs. Her breasts look a little bit depleted, but in my mind, those demigods who were cast out to the wilderness to die, they look plump. Her eyes look absolutely tired. And I think for many of you who have worked on late nights finishing projects, or had a weekend where you had way too much fun, you probably recognize that look. And then her body is actually a physical canopy and shelter. And so the one thing though I do feel is that she could become ferocious at a moment's notice. And so this looking at this image, it really made me start to think a lot about this word mother. And, you know, what is it to be a mother? I'm a mother of two. I have a 9-year-old and a 16-year-old. But I also am interested in what it would it be if we considered mother as a non-binary word, and what are the attributes that we all hold within us that are mother-like. In this particular piece, I was also interested in associations of mother as it relates to earth, mother as a term of endearment, or perhaps not. I actually really love my mother. And then I think it's also interesting that mother is used as an expletive. So around this time when I'm thinking of mother, I have this word mother going on in my head. I was listening to some music, and Marvin Gaye's What's Going On came on. And so I think one thing that I'd like you to know about this song, What's Going On, is that it was originally, the lyrics were originally penned by Obie Benson of the Four Tops. And he was on a bus actually that was going through People's Park in Berkeley. And he saw this huge protest, was a Vietnam War protest. And he basically asked himself, what's going on? And then through a lot of effort, he convinced Marvin Gaye to take this song and sing. And so one of the things I think that's really important to know about this like political and cultural moment in 1970 is that this was a self-produced song. Is it Ruby Gordon? He, the record company was not interested in creating a record that had social and political content. It came together doing what artists do, which is like a bunch of musicians came together and supported one another to kind of create this. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's this like initial background noise and conversation. And then it goes into the words. It goes mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, sister, father, father. And I started really thinking about how in the Indigenous communities, in my community, the way of thinking about our relatedness, it goes beyond that too. It reaches out to grandfather, grandfather, and auntie, auntie, and grandmother, grandmother, and really ancestor, ancestor. And one of the things I love about the pairing of these words is it like reaches back in time in a way, and it reaches forward in time by having this twinning language. And so I've started to think of Marvin Gaye song What's Going On as this like Marvin Gaye knowledge intersecting with Indigenous knowledge about our relatedness. And part of that relatedness is not about biological connections, but it's really about how we're all connected. And so this connection is humans, animals, environment. We're all responsible to one another, and we need to both listen and work to steward this planet into the future for the next generation. So this piece is called Companion Species, We Are Here Now. And around the time when I was like starting to kind of play with these canine forms, I made this sketch and I was invited to go to the Corning Museum of Art to work with gaffer Jeff Mack. And I showed him that image, and we were talking about all the different ways we could work with glass. And I wasn't even necessarily drawn to working with glass, in part because I suppose the decorative art history of that material is not something that really speaks to me. But when I showed him that drawing, he said, "Oh, let's interpret that." And it was incredibly exciting. And so I think for me, one of the things that it helped me do in this exploration is I knew I wanted to work three-dimensionally, and it really kind of gave me the necessary push and confidence to move forward. And so from this small-ish crystal piece created with Jeff Mack and the amazing gaffers at the Corning Museum of Art, I went on to create this piece in my studio called Companion Species Underbelly. And in this particular piece, I was really interested in kind of making an animal that was that we as humans didn't have dominion over, that was like larger than us, and then also creating this open underbelly space, which is a space that's incredibly vulnerable and private, and that in a way she is opening her body to share with us. So this piece was created in my studio. And it weighs about 1.5 tons. It's built out of aromatic cedar. I knew I needed to be able to pass through a door jamb that was 60 inches wide. So it actually breaks into 20 parts. It was constructed first starting with a 3D scan from a small maquette. And then it was built in kind of these topographical layers based on the thickness of the wood. So the other thing I think that's really important in this piece is when you walk up to it, it really, or not even walk up to it, I think even before you get to a room where it exists, it is like its scent announces itself. And I think that that's also really important to my work, that there's a tactile, kinesthetic, sensory experience. It's something that's just important to me. So this piece is called Companion Species Field, and I'm interested in how, army blankets are used to conceal us, and in concealing us, I think of how they're also kind of a metaphor for a landscape. So in that piece that I just shared, Companion Species Field, there is I'll just go back there. You can see the dogs, there's the dog's tongue, and it's actually created from painting. I did paintings of tongues, and then it's created using a palette of French knots. And so one of the things that I was really drawn to is this beautiful painting that I saw during a special exhibition at the Portland Art Museum here in Oregon. But it was this painting of Asher Wertheimer by John Singer Sargent. And I think what's like just kind of extraordinary about this painting is just like how these points of light, not so different from a Vermeer, how these points of light move our eyes around this canvas, and how you can barely see the dog, but what you do see is this tongue. And I started to think about how that dog's tongue, well, the dog has a tongue, I have a tongue. It's sort of a emblem of our relatedness, but I also started thinking about how important tongues are, not only in terms of like feeding us nutrients, but also in terms of our responsibility to speak up for those entities and things that cannot speak up for themselves. So here, this piece is called Companion Species Tongue Petal. And I really became quite interested in how this tongue also functions the way a petal functions for a flower. And again, it becomes this other example of our relatedness. So in this piece, Companion Species Cosmos Sunrise Flint, I look at this kind of shaped, this shape as being megaphone-like, or even sort of tongue-like, and the color for me is urgent. It's a piece that is compiled out of panels that were created and open to the community sewing circles at the Crystal Bridges Museum and other locations. This has that similar shape of being sort of megaphone-like, and is the beginning of an exploration I'm in the midst of in regards to using neon in my work. And one of the things I decided to do for this piece is actually used tape on my body that mimicked the tape that was used to mimic the neon. And so in this piece, I was interested in how that kind of dotted line might mimic stitching, and how a glass tube that's used in neon is like a thread or a bead. And one of the things that I learned as soon as I put my body against that text piece with text on my chest is that Turtle Island is this place that I return to, right? And so in many ways, I was returning myself to that fold and acknowledging this interconnected relationship. I've also been using beads in my work, and these beads are antique beads that come from the island of Murano. And there was a consortium of bead workers that disbanded in the 1920s. And so these beads have been like sitting in storage until a bead seller recently got custody of them. But one of the things that I'm drawn to is how there's different Seneca beaded objects that I've seen and that have beads that are very similar to these, and this notion of this material that is this connection between something my ancestors have used and something that I'm using today. So this was one of the early beaded pieces, and I have to confess, it's very hard to understand the scale of that pennant. This is a beaded piece called Antipode. So in 2009, I moved to New York with my family during kind of that economic downturn. My husband received a job offer, and we were both self-employed. And so he took one for the team, and we moved to New York City with our youngest daughter, who's now 16. And while we were there, I had thought I'd traded in the conifers of the Pacific Northwest for skyscrapers and scaffolding. And so one of the things that I appreciated is we lived in Brooklyn, New York, but we lived right next to this area of Gowanus and Borum Hill, where Iroquois ironworkers had settled in the 40s and 50s. And at that moment, there were so many Iroquois ironworkers that there was actually a mass done in the Mohawk language in that community. And so one thing that I will share with you all is that as a kid, I saw Star Wars in its first run at a movie theater. And I always remember there being this pride that not only did Star Wars have a Skywalker, but also our community had Skywalkers too. And so we've long considered our iron workers to be Skywalkers. So my most recent work has really been looking a lot at the poetry of Joy Harjo, and this poem in particular called Singing Everything. It says, once there were songs for everything, songs for growing, for harvesting, for eating, for getting drunk, falling asleep, for sunrise, birth, mind break, and war. And the poem continues. I think one thing that's important to me is just thinking about what do we want to sing a song for in this moment? And I realized that every day what you might want to sing a song for might change, but some of the songs some of the things I've been thinking we need to sing songs for are glaciers and water and animals and grandmothers. Okay, but like I said, every day it could be something different. And so one thing I've been doing is sort of through this stream of consciousness, writing down words that I'm hoping to sing a song for. And so these panels were stitched at Open to the Community Sewing Circles here in Portland during the little window of time, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but that little window of time when it seemed like the pandemic might be behind us. And so this happened at Oregon Center for Contemporary Art, and also at Selwood Park. And here's the sign that I often share with the community. This is a piece called Companion Species, A Distant Song. And one of the things that I was hoping it would mimic is the feeling of a sunrise. And in thinking about sunrises, right now, someplace, there is a sunrise happening. So it's a moment that we all share. I think that sunrises are beautiful because they're these moments that can't be fixed. And so a lot of what stays with us is the memory of that moment versus a visual image of it. But I also think that it's important to remember that what makes sunrises really beautiful in this moment is also what might kill us. In my studio, we have a joke about a hashtag that I hope you all will implement in your own work, and it's called Dogs for Scale. And this is another study for a neon piece. I believe that people who participated in the recent sewing circle were the recipient of these prints at Vanderbilt. And we'll end with this image from the Emory Museum. And I thought maybe one thing we should sing a song for is tardigrades. And this sewing circle participant, she actually drew a little image of a tardigrade on this particular piece. So I thank you all for your time. Oh no, you know what? I realize. Okay, I forgot one thing. Sorry, I thought I was close to the end. I just want to share this project that I worked on with Chanupa Hanska Luger. It's called Each Other, and some people might have participated in this project. We did a call and invited people to stitch a word or image that they wanted to share in this moment. And we created this large sculpture, which has a pelt of bandanas. And of course, bandanas are used to conceal one's identity, but also used as PPE wear in this moment. And so with that, I believe I am done. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. It was lovely. Thank you so much for the presentation. We are going to turn it over to